My name is Matt, and my childhood wasn't normal. Not by any stretch of the word. Something happened to my family that is almost impossible to understand. But I'm going to try my best to explain those 5 years. 5 years of my life I spent in terror. 5 years we all lived in fear. 5 years we'll never get back. My father, Spence, wasn't a very strong man, both physically and mentally. He was the type of dad who often let our mother speak for the both of them. Now, he wasn't a complete pushover, but he was often just content to go with the flow rather than alter it. He worked hard and dedicated his free time to us, his family. He made sure our needs were taken care of. His soft assurances the unseen foundation of our family. My mother, Megan, was the head of our house. She was outspoken, independent, and extremely loyal to all of us. She loved my father's quiet ways, and even from a young age, I could see the chemistry flowing strong between them. My little sister, Stephanie, was a year younger than I. She looked up to me, and my father always told me it was my responsibility to look after her. We got along as best as we could, and even though I gave her all kinds of brotherly hardship, I did love her. We lived in a suburban, middle-class community, a complete stock photo of the American dream. My father worked a respectable 9-to-5 job, while my mother taught yoga classes out of the house. It was a neat life, organized and structured. Everything was discussed, considered, and acted upon as a family. It was a good home to grow up in. But that was before he showed up. That was before the third parent. July 1989. I was sitting at the dinner table waiting for my father to finish cooking. It was his turn tonight, and my stomach roared for his rosemary chicken. My sister, Stephanie, lay on her stomach in the living room coloring. Her golden blonde hair fell across her shoulders in waves, and she looked up at me, smiling. She extended what she had been working on, and I nodded, completely unimpressed. She sniffed at me and continued her sketch. My mother walked into the kitchen, pulling her hair back from her freshly showered face. "Everyone gone?" my father asked from the stove. My mother nodded. "Yeah, Spence, the house is ours again. It's so much better teaching yoga in the basement, so much cooler. I'm glad we finished the basement over the winter. My clients are relieved as well. It's a scorcher out there today." "Mom, can you sit down so we can eat?" I begged from my spot at the table. My mother turned to me and laughed. "Oh, Matt, the hungriest 6-year-old on this side of the Mississippi. Why don't you ask your dad to hurry up? He's the one cooking." I placed my forehead on the table's lip. "Dad, I'm gonna die." Stephanie looked up from her coloring book. "Matt, don't be crazy." "You're crazy," I muttered, not looking up. "Nuh-uh," she said, sticking her tongue out at me. All right, my father said, turning from the stove. In his hands, he held a steaming platter of chicken. "Come sit down, Steph, the food is ready," I ordered to my sister, the sight of the seasoned meat causing me to salivate. As she pulled herself up from the floor, my mother taking a place beside me, we all froze as someone knocked on the front door. My mother and father exchanged puzzled looks. My dad placed the food down on the table and told all of us to hold on a minute. Groaning, I watched him walk to the front door. He peeked through the keyhole and I saw him visibly tense, his whole body cementing like a statue. "Spence, who is it?" my mother asked. My father slowly turned back around to us. all blood draining from his face. His eyes were wide, and I saw fear dilate his pupils. He licked his lips and shot Stephanie and I a look. "Spence," my mom pressed, her face contorting with concern. "No, this can't happen. Not again," I heard my father whisper, staring off into the middle distance. The door shook as another series of knocks echoed throughout the home. My mother stood, her voice cracking with contagious fear. "Spence, who is it? What's going on?" "I'm so sorry," my father mumbled, clutching his stomach, his face a pale sheet. "I have to let him in." Before any of us could say anything else, my dad turned and opened the door. Dying sunlight blinded me, and I squinted to see who our unannounced visitor was. "Hi, I'm Tommy Taffy. It's good to see you again, Spence." I watched as my father slowly backed away from the open door. A man entered our home and shut the door behind him. My young mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but even at that age, I knew something wasn't right with this unexpected guest. He was about 6 feet tall and had a shock of golden hair cut tight along his scalp. He wore khaki shirts and a white t-shirt that said "Hi" in red cartoon font. But that wasn't what caught my eye. It was his skin. It was completely devoid of pores, a perfectly smooth, creamy texture that looked almost like soft plastic. His face was a pool of gentle pink, his mouth a cheerful cut along his cheeks revealing a white strip of teeth. But they weren't teeth. It was just a smooth, edgeless road like he had a mouth guard on. His nose was just a slight rise out of his face, like a doll, void of nostrils. And his eyes were twin puddles of sparkling blue, shining out at us from his flawless, eerie face. They were wide, like he was in a constant state of surprise, and they shifted around the room to look at us in quick, jarring motion. His smile widened, and he raised a flawless hand to us at the table. "Hi, I'm Tommy Taffy. It's good to meet you." I noticed he didn't have any fingernails or skin defects. No wrinkles or bruises, nothing. It was like he was a living, talking, human-sized doll. "Spence," my mother croaked, recognition blooming in her eyes. "It's gonna be okay, Megan," my father said, voice shaken. "Let's just be polite to our new guest, okay?" The man, Tommy, cocked his head towards my father. My dad took a step back, raising his hands. I mean our new friend." The frozen smile never left Tommy's molded face. There was no humor in his strange laugh. It sounded like he was clearing his throat or imitating a really bad chuckle. It was too pronounced, each syllable sounding too deliberate. My father forced a smile onto his face. I meant..." He looked desperately at my mother, who offered him no help, her body frozen in absolute fear. I meant, meet your new parent, kids." Stephanie, who was standing by our mother, frowned. "He's not our dad, you are. And why does he look so funny?" "Stephanie," my mother hissed, gripping my sister's shoulder. Tommy laughed and walked forward to crouch in front of Stephanie. "It's not nice to make fun of people who look different now, is it?" My sister looked at her feet, blushing. Tommy tasseled her hair. "It's okay. Buck up, kiddo. We're going to get along just fine. I'm gonna help your parents raise you. It's a big job being a mommy and daddy. Sometimes, mommy and daddies need a help. Tommy turned to my parents, that ever-present plastic smile stretching across his face. I helped their mommy and daddy raise them. Isn't that right, Spence? Megan? Megan pulled Stephanie away as my father nodded nervously. That's right, kids, he did. Tommy smiled and turned to me. I was still sitting at the table, taking the odd scene in. I didn't understand what was happening. Didn't know who this weird-looking man was or what he wanted. What he was saying didn't make any sense, but my parents seemed to know him, so I kept my speculations to myself. And you must be Matt, Tommy said, walking over to me. I didn't look at him, training my eyes to stare at my empty plate. I suddenly wasn't hungry anymore. I could feel the strange man beside me, his presence filling my head. I licked my lips and felt my heart begin to race. I didn't like this intruder. Something about him felt dangerous. Tommy walked behind me, chuckling, his hand sliding over my slender shoulders. Oh, it looks like we have a shy one. That's okay. I'll help him with that, he said to my parents. His fingers dug into my skin and I winced, but I kept my mouth shut. Don't touch him, my mother hissed, eyes going wide. Tommy looked up at her, mouth stretched. My dad outstretched his hand, alarmed. Don't be so rude, Megan. Tommy continued to stare at my mother, who nervously lowered her eyes. Are you staying for dinner? Stephanie suddenly asked, breaking the tense silence. The eerie, dull man let go of my shoulders, one of his hands sliding across my cheek and into my hair. Oh, yeah. I'll be here for quite a while. And that was how Tommy Taffy entered our lives. At 6 years old, I didn't know any better than to seriously question what was happening. Even though my parents acted unsettled at his arrival, their constant assurances that he was a friend pushed away any lingering doubt I had. As the days turned into weeks, I began to grow accustomed to Tommy's presence in our home. My initial fear slowly receded to wary caution. I soon learned that Tommy didn't like company. Whenever my mother had her yoga classes, Tommy would pull her into a corner and whisper something to her. I would watch all of this with silent eyes. I would see my mother's face grow pale and she would nod, whispering back unknown assurances. Then Tommy would turn, that ever-present smile plastered on his face, and walk upstairs until the class was over. My parents told Stephanie and I that we weren't to talk about Tommy to our friends. Outside of the home, Tommy wasn't a part of our lives. I don't know why, but both my sister and I obeyed. Another thing I noticed was that Tommy never ate. He would sit at the table with us, but never partook in the meal. Stephanie asked him once if he was ever hungry, and Tommy just smiled and silently stroked her head. During the evenings, he would gather our family into the living room and give us a short lesson on how to be a good person. My parents never spoke during these talks, just sat next to us, nodding. Tommy told us not to make fun of others, to love our friends and enemies and always help those in need. He told us that's why we were here with us, to help my parents raise us, that we could come talk to him if we had a problem at school or didn't know how to handle a certain situation. It went on like this for a month, and that's when my mother lost it. August 1989. My father had just arrived home from work, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework. My mother was cooking dinner, and Stephanie was practicing her dance for an upcoming school play. She was going to be a ballerina and had 3 weeks to learn a few simple spins and twirls. She had been diligently practicing over the past few days, but just couldn't get it right. She was young, and her temper was getting the better of her. That's when Tommy decided to help. He had been sitting on the couch watching her when suddenly he rose and stood behind my sister, placing his hands gently over her shoulders. "Let me help, sweetie," he cooed, his voice carrying a cheerful note. My mother spun around from the stove and I saw her visibly tense. She didn't like Tommy touching us. She gripped the wooden spoon in her hand until her knuckles went white, watching as Tommy crouched and cupped Stephanie's body with his. He took her hands in from his from behind and guided her arms and waist, her cheek pressing gently against my sister's. "Tommy, let her learn on her own," my mother said, her voice shaking. Tommy didn't even look at her, just kept guiding my sister. I could hear my father coming down the stairs, freshly changed from a day at the office. Tommy spun my sister, and for the first time, she nailed the twirl, her little feet twisting her body in a complete circle. Tommy clapped his hands once, and then leaned down and kissed Stephanie on the cheek. "Good girl." "Don't do that," my mother shrieked, dropping the spoon, her face draining of blood. I jumped in my seat at the table and swallowed hard. I didn't know why my mother was getting so upset. He was just helping her. I also knew, deep down, that it was a bad idea to yell at the new member of our family. It was the gut instinct of a child, a gentle warning that rumbled in my head. Tommy stood. My father was standing at the foot of the stairs now, frozen, unsure of what to make of the confrontation. Megan, what's wrong?" he asked. My mother's eyes never left Tommy. "Spence, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything is all right. We know what this monster is. We know what he did to our town all those years ago. I want him out of our house." My father's eyes went wide, panic blooming in his face. "Megan!" He licked his lips, eyes darting back and forth at all of us. "Don't be rude. Tommy has been a big help." My mother grit her teeth. "Stop that. Stop pretending we want him here. I can't watch this happen. I want him out." Very slowly, Tommy walked into the kitchen and stood in front of my mother. He looked down at her, his perfect blue eyes shining like crystal moons. His voice was like frozen silk. "Megan, would you like to come down into the basement with me? I need to have a few words with you." My mother took a step back. "Get away from me. Get away from my family. You're not welcome here anymore." She turned desperate eyes to my father. "Spence, do something." My dad raised his hands in a gesture of helplessness. I could see he was terrified. Stephanie was watching from the living room, her lip quivering, eyes watering. I suddenly wanted to go comfort her, but I felt glued to my chair. "Come now, Megan, just a quick word." "Fuck you," my mother spat. I gasped, heart dropping into my stomach. I had never heard my mother swear before, and it scared me stiff. Suddenly, Tommy grabbed my mother by the back of the neck, the smile never leaving his face, and yanked her to the basement door. "Spence, stop him! Help me!" my mother screamed, helplessly trying to remove Tommy's iron grip from her. Tommy shot my dad a look that froze him where he stood. I'm sorry, Megan. We need to do what he says," he cried. Stephanie was now openly crying, hands at her sides, tears running down her face. I felt sick as I watched Tommy open the basement door and drag my mother down into the dark. The door slammed closed behind them. It was silent for a few minutes, and then the screams began. I had never heard my mother scream before, and the sound of it shattered me. My father ran into the kitchen and scooped me up into his arms and then snatched up Stephanie in his other one. He marched us upstairs into his bedroom and dumped us onto the bed. We sat huddled like that for hours, none of us speaking a word. My mother continued to scream. Finally, long after the sun set, we heard the basement door open. "Mom's sleeping in the basement tonight," Tommy called out. March 1991. 2 years have passed. After that night, my mother never resisted or talked back to Tommy again. When she came out of the basement the following morning, I expected to see her covered in bruises and blood, but I could see no visible signs of violence. I was too young to understand what had happened, why my mother now walked with a limp and would for the rest of her life. She didn't speak to my father for a month, and even then it was just enough to get by. I noticed my father crying a lot during those years. I didn't know what was happening to my family, but I kept my mouth shut and obeyed the rules. Listen to Tommy, and don't talk about Tommy to others. Things went calm during those years. Tommy continued to give us life lessons and be a part of our home. No one but my family knew that he was living with us. He was our secret, the dark star that hung above our heads. I learned to smile around Tommy, as did my sister. If he thought we were happy, he seemed more relaxed. But that night, my mother challenged him. That changed something. Every couple of months, Tommy would assert his authority over my parents. He would test them, stretch the limits of their patience and nerves. Most of the time, my father and mother would humbly submit to whatever mind game he played with them. Most of the time, he would do or say something to Stephanie or myself. It always made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he would have us sit in our lap while he stroked our hair. Sometimes he'd sing strange songs to my sister about love. Other times, he would make us take a bath together while he watched. I always put on a brave face during these times. Stephanie was young still, so she wasn't as bothered as I was. It was uncomfortable, and I would look to my parents for guidance. With pale faces, they'd nod silently, and I continued in whatever activity we were forced into doing. It was in the early part of 1991 when the next awful thing happened to my family. Tommy pushed the limits once again. I rubbed sleep from my eyes and looked at my race car clock on the wall. The glow-in-the-dark hands read 2 a.m. I could hear something in the hallway outside my room. It sounded like someone crying. Where was Tommy? I checked the dark corners of my room to make sure he wasn't there, watching me sleep. When I was assured he wasn't, I pulled the covers away and slipped to the floor. I crept to my door and looked out into the dark. I could see a figure sitting on the floor by my sister's closed door. A person. I squinted in the black and realized it was my father with his hands over his face. He was sobbing, his back against the wall. "Dad?" I whispered. My father looked up and immediately shooed me back into my room. I just stood there as my eyes adjusted to the night. My father's face was a mess of blood and bruises. "Go back to bed, Matt, please," he cried. I took a hesitant step out into the hallway. "Dad, what happened to your face? What's going on? Did Tommy do that?" My father's eyes went wide and he shushed me. No, of course not. Don't say such things. Tommy is he's here to help us be a better family." I walked closer to my dad and froze as I passed my sister's door. I could hear muffled cries from inside. I could hear fear. "Dad," I whispered, pointing to the door. "What's wrong with Steph?" My father wiped a trail of blood from his lips, eyes watering, anguish stretching his features. Come here, Matt." I crawled into his outstretched arms as something loud banged against the wall from my sister's room. I jumped and my father curled me up into his chest. I could feel tears drip onto my head as he fought back misery. "Tommy's in there, isn't he?" I asked quietly. My dad sniffled. "Yeah, son." I looked up into his bloody face. "What did you do, Dad?" My dad tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. He wanted to do something with your sister I didn't like, and I told him no." As he spoke, I realized I could hear my mother crying from the bedroom. My dad cupped his hand under my chin. "We can't say no to Tommy, okay? Remember that." My sister screamed from her bedroom, a shrill, piercing cry that shook me to my soul. I gripped my father's arm. "Why is he here? Why can't he just go away?" My father was silent for a moment, and then he lowered his mouth to my ear. "Listen to me, Matt. This is very important. When you grow up, do not have children. He follows those with children." I shifted in my father's arms as something was dragged across the hardwood floor from the other side of the wall. My father grit his teeth, more tears spilling. We don't know who he is or what he is. He just came to our town when we were little boys and girls, just like you and Stephanie. Your mother and I lived 2 houses down from one another, and Tommy infested our street. I don't know how. He was everywhere, always. He'd be at my house, but also across the street, and also at your mother's, all at the same time. I don't know what he wants, what his purpose is. He just showed up one day. He just showed up and wouldn't go away. God knows my father tried." "Is that how Grandpa died?" I asked. I had never met my grandpa. I just knew he had died years before I was born. My father nodded. "Yes, Matt. Tommy had to teach him a lesson. He had to teach the entire street a lesson. After that, why can't you just kill him?" I whispered ever so softly. My dad brought his mouth closer to my ear, his voice barely audible. We tried everything. We burned him, shot him, cut him into pieces, but it never worked. He always came back knocking at our door, and someone had to pay. Someone always had to pay. If we didn't follow his rules, someone had to pay. Tommy was our secret. He was our invisible monster hidden from the outside world. Deaths were covered up, abuse was brushed under the rug, because we knew if anybody said a word, Tommy would make it bad for whoever had to face his punishment. I digested all of this with the understanding of an 8-year-old, and the only thing I could think to say was, "When is he going away?" My father kissed me on the top of my head. 3 more years. The bedroom door suddenly opened and my father jumped, tumbling me out of his arms. Tommy stood in the dark, his face perfectly composed except he was breathing hard. His plastic-looking face scared me, his 2 blue eyes glowing out of the black. Tommy jabbed a thumb over his shoulder at the now silent bedroom. "She's gonna sleep like a log tonight." September 1993. We had 1 year left. 1 more year. I could almost see the desperation in my parents' eyes grow every day, begging the calendar to advance. We were almost through the nightmare. I thought a lot about what my father had told me that horrible night in the hallway. I thought about what he must have gone through as a child, what he must have experienced. I wondered how bad things must have gotten for Tommy to murder my grandfather. I realize now that despite all the awful things Tommy was doing, my father's submission was keeping us alive. His agonized silence kept Tommy's wrath at bay. Looking back, I can't imagine the mental torture he endured during those 5 years. Stephanie didn't talk much after that night in March. I noticed her charismatic personality decline drastically, and suddenly she was an unsmiling, silent child. I don't think she understood what happened to her as she grew up. I think her mind slowly began to build a wall, blocking that night out from her mind's eye. My mother and father seemed to be extra compliant that last year. They engaged in Tommy's nighttime lessons with added enthusiasm, and my mother made sure desperately that Stephanie and I react in ways that made Tommy happy, but I didn't make it out unscathed. Tommy was sure to make his mark on our entire family. I was sitting in my room with the door closed. It was almost dinner time and everyone was downstairs getting ready. I could hear Tommy laughing from the living room. I looked down at the magazines one of my friends at school had given me. It was a Playboy. We had pored over the pages at school, giggling and ogling over the naked women scattered throughout the magazine. I had never seen anything like it. It was my first exposure to that world. It made my heart race in ways I enjoyed, and I felt something weird but pleasurable stirring inside of me. I had asked my friend if I could borrow the magazine, and he had let me. I adjusted myself on the bed and pored over the nude photos. I couldn't believe women actually let people take pictures of them like this. I felt something stir in my pants as I turned another page. My heart was racing and I felt hot, my cheeks flush. I was on the last page when I heard something from the doorway. "What you got there, Matt?" I whipped my head up, jumping, the magazine falling to the floor. Tommy was watching me from the door. I hadn't even heard him open it. Nothing," I mumbled, snatching the Playboy up and shoving it under my pillow. Tommy walked over to me. I didn't hear you come in," I mumbled, blushing. Tommy reached under my pillow and pulled out the magazine. "It's not nice to lie, Matt. I've told you that." "Why were you lying to me, Matt?" I swallowed hard, the heart thundering against my rib cage. I'm sorry. I'm. I trailed off miserably as Tommy thumbed through the pages. He glanced down at me. "Do you like this?" I knew I couldn't lie to him again, so I nodded, my skin flush, eyes on the floor. Tommy smiled and sat down next to me on the bed, one hand resting on my thigh. "Do these pictures make you feel good?" I didn't look at him as I nodded again. Suddenly, Tommy slid his hand over my crotch and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Does it make that feel good, Matt?" I jumped, his touch scaring me. He removed his hand and chuckled, his strip of seamless teeth sparkling. Tommy put the magazine down and cupped his hand under my chin. "Do you know how to pleasure yourself, Matt? Has your father told you how to do that?" My breath came in short gasps, his hand cool and smooth against my face. I didn't know what he was talking about and didn't know what he wanted me to say. I just stared at him with helpless eyes. Tommy sighed. It's probably best he hasn't. It's a sensitive discussion. I feel like I should have it with you, not him. You're what, 10 now?" I nodded, paralyzed. Tommy slowly reached down and grasped my crotch again. "Do you want me to show you how to do it?" I squirmed under his grip. No thank you, Tommy." Tommy smiled gently. "It's okay to be scared. Growing up is scary. You're gonna be such a handsome young man." He stroked my cheek with his other hand, one now on my cheek, the other still grasping my groin. "Have you had your first kiss yet?" Tommy, please," I cried, feeling tears begin to form in my eyes. Tommy pushed me back on the bed, and I was now staring up at him as he cupped my head in his hand. "You don't have to be afraid of growing up, Matt. There's a lot of good things to look forward to. And just think, when you have children, I'll help you raise them. It's going to be fun." Let me go," I whispered, openly crying now, his breath hot on my face. Tommy suddenly leaned down and kissed me, his lips engulfing mine. I let out a squeal of panic as I felt his tongue slip into my mouth, his grip tightening around my crotch. His mouth tasted of rotting fruit and decaying meat, a rush of filth that invaded my taste buds. He rolled his lips around mine and then pulled away, whispered, "Not going to get hard for me?" I just cried, staring up at him with shocked, panicked eyes. Tommy smiled and whispered in my ear, "That's okay." He suddenly sat up, releasing me. "Come on, dinner's ready." Shaking, I wiped my face and let him help me off of the bed. I wasn't hungry. July 1994. As the days marched closer and closer towards July, my family developed a silent, optimistic, desperate plea to make this all stop, to make it all go away. My mother and father made sure there was no reason for another hard lesson. They bent over backwards for Tommy, begging through clamped teeth that we'd all make it to July without another incident. On July 3rd, we woke up to find Tommy Taffy was gone. 5 years to the day. We couldn't believe it, and he had simply vanished overnight. We checked the entire home, my mother wiping tears of relieved joy that the nightmare was finally over. After checking every inch of the home 3 times over, we met in the living room, embracing one another as a family. Tommy had moved on. The sentence was over. My father called out of work and we went away for 2 weeks to the beach. During those 2 weeks, I kept expecting to wake up with Tommy standing over me, that horrific smile on his face, but he didn't. It was over. My parents did their best to rebuild our family, fill in the cracks that had been made during those long years, and I loved them dearly for it. But some monsters just can't be forgotten. I don't know what Tommy was or where he came from. I don't think I'll ever know. What was his purpose? Why did he do all those awful things to us? I pored over the possible answers until my head splits and I find myself crying. The memory's too much to dig up. Some things are just left dead in the past. But I haven't forgotten what my father told me in the hallway that night outside my sister's room. I'm 33 now and have remained unmarried and without children. I can't risk it. I can't risk that monster coming back into my life. I've never understood why my parents chose to have kids. They both had been exposed to Tommy during their childhood. So why have Stephanie and I? Maybe they didn't believe he'd come back, but I believe it, and I'm terrified. Because you see, yesterday, my sister gave birth to twins. Some of you may have read my son's account, The Third Parent, about what happened regarding the monster Tommy Taffy. After reading it, after crying over it, I felt compelled to write this. I'm not here to defend my actions. I'm not here to make excuses. I knew what Tommy was capable of. I knew what we'd have to endure. But I also knew that if we could make it 5 years, 5 years without pissing off Tommy Taffy, we'd come out of that nightmare alive. How did I know that? Because I had already lived it. I had already been exposed to what that thing was capable of. I had seen Tommy's temper. I had seen what pushed his buttons. I had already done my 5 years. Like I said, I'm not here to defend myself. What happened to my family is unspeakable, but we are alive. No, instead, I'm writing this so that you can understand why I did what I did. why I chose to let Tommy do what he did to my wife and children. After you hear my side, after you hear what I went through, then you can judge me. God knows I deserve it. Tommy first arrived on my street when I was 7. I was an only child and lived with both my parents in a middle-class neighborhood. It was a mellow slice of the American dream, like a cut of apple pie under a smothering layer of vanilla ice cream. Our street was in a secluded residential neighborhood in the far corner of our sprawling development. There were 6 houses in total, and we were a tight-knit bunch, both the parents and children. In the summer, we'd have cookouts, and in the winter, we'd have Christmas parties. It was almost like our block was one big family. Everyone looked out for one another. Everyone was generous and considerate. It was a different time when people trusted one another. But our picture-perfect life shattered when he arrived. Jesus, I'll never forget it. July 1969. I had just gone to bed, my 7-year-old exploring my imagination and turning thought into dream. The moon was a warm slice of yellow in my window, an expanse of stars winking down at me as I drifted off to sleep. I could hear the TV on in the living room, a comforting reminder that my parents were still awake and the monsters under my bed would stay away tonight. That's when I bolted awake by a knock at the front door downstairs. It was a sharp contrast to the comforting murmur of the TV that my mind went on full alert as the noise echoed into the home. I sat up in bed, irritated, clutching Growls, my teddy bear. I heard the heavy footsteps of my father walk to the door, probably expecting a neighbor. The familiar creak at the front door was followed by the muted murmur of conversation. I could hear my father's voice speaking, interrupted on occasion by another male voice I didn't recognize. My mother joined the conversation and I could hear my father getting angry. Minutes stretched on as the mysterious late-night visitor continued to talk with my parents. I slid out of bed and went to my bedroom door, and peeking my head out to listen. I still couldn't make out the words, but I could tell my father was getting furious. He started yelling, and I heard him demand that the visitor leave our home or he was calling the cops. It got very quiet then. It was so quiet I could hear my heart beating in my chest. Then I heard my mother begin to cry. It was soft, so soft, but it scared me. The nighttime visitor was saying something to my parents, his voice low, and my mother continued to sob. After a moment, my father said something I couldn't make out. Immediately following, I heard something slam into the wall downstairs so hard the pictures in the hallway crashed to the floor. I slapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, my heart racing. What was going on? My mother let out a pitiful noise and I could hear her pleading with someone. There was a scramble of feet and then another loud bang against the wall. The intruder was saying something to my parents, his voice oozing with authority. I strained to make out the words, but it came to me in a jumble of soft noise. After another couple minutes of agonizing fear, I heard my father call down for me. My heart was a wild drum beat in my chest and I bit my lip, hands shaking. Why did he want me? What was happening? My father called again, his voice trembling slightly. Slowly, I pulled the door to my bedroom open and walked to the edge of the stairs. I realized I was clutching Growls, my teddy bear. My palms were sweaty and I could feel his soft fur growing damp. I looked down the stairs to the front door and I froze, eyes going wide. My father was gripping his throat, wincing, tears in his eyes, something I had never seen before. My mother had her arms wrapped around herself, moisture staining her cheeks. But that wasn't what captured my attention. It was the stranger standing next to my parents, staring up at me. He was in his early 30s and wore a white t-shirt that read in red font, "Hi." His hair was blonde and cut short. His two blue eyes, pools of glowing brilliance set in a sea of snow. And then I noticed the oddities of this intruder. His skin was impossibly smooth, a clean, pink sheen of absolute perfection. His nose wasn't so much a nose as it was a nub jutting out of his face. His lips were twisted in a smile, revealing white strips where his teeth should have been. "Hi, Spence," he called up to me, his voice cheerful. "I'm Tommy Taffy. I'm gonna be staying with you for a while." I clutched growls in my chest, quivering, begging my parents for guidance. Instead, they cast their eyes to the floor, clearly shaken. I didn't know what was happening, what had been said between them, but I could feel danger in the air, thick and malicious. "Come on down here so I can get a good look at you," Tommy said, waving me forward. My father's eyes suddenly met mine and I gulped. Even at that age, I can interpret the look he passed on to me. "Be careful, son." Cautiously, I walked down the stairs, never letting go of my bear. When I reached the foot of the stairs, my mother reached out for me, but Tommy stepped in front of her, smiling down at me. He squatted down and ruffled my hair, his immaculate skin looking almost polished and waxed at this proximity. "Cute little fella, aren't you? Aw, who's that you got?" he asked, gesturing at my bear. His name is Growls," I stammered. Tommy grinned. "Of course he is. I'm going to help your parents for a while, so I'd like the three of us to be friends. Me, you, and Growls. You think that'd be okay?" Again, I looked to my parents for help, confused and shaken. I had no idea what was going on, who this was, why my parents looked so scared. He seemed nice enough, but the way my father rubbed his throat told me otherwise. "Boop boop." Tommy chuckled, knocking gently on my head. "Hey, I asked you a question, Spence." What did you do to my daddy?" I whispered, immediately wishing I hadn't. Tommy's mouth remained a frozen smile, but his eyes darkened ever so slightly. My father reached out and grasped my shoulder. "Spence, son, it's okay. I'll talk to you later about it. For now, Tommy's gonna... he's gonna..." He shot a look at my mother. "He's gonna stay with us." And that was the start of a 5-year stretch I can never forget. A few days passed, and soon I learned, through whispered inquiries, that Tommy Taffy had visited everyone on our street. He was in our home, but also in theirs. I learned this from my eventual wife, Megan, who lived across the street from me. She told me that some strange guy was living in their home. After she described him, I deducted it was one and the same. Tommy Taffy. I didn't understand how it was possible, but knew to keep my mouth shut. Tommy swore me to secrecy. He swore everyone to secrecy. This was enforced by my parents, who told me in hushed whispers to never tell anyone about Tommy. I could tell everyone feared him. I did too. There was something unsettling about his constant smile, his slightly off features, and the cool, enunciated way he spoke and laughed. I didn't know what he had told my parents to keep them from going to the police, why they were allowing him to live in our home, but it must have been terrible. We were a hostage in our own house. Of course, Tommy didn't keep us there, but we knew he would be waiting once we came back. At night, Tommy would sit us down and give us life lessons. He would tell us how to be good people, how to love one another. I remember one time, during the first week, I looked out my front window across the street into Megan's living room. I saw Tommy there, speaking to her family on the couch. The Tommy in front of my family stopped speaking and immediately stared long and hard at me. Then he went to the window and closed the curtains before continuing. During the evenings, as the fathers on our street came home from work, I'd see them meet briefly in the road, muttering to each other and casting looks over their shoulders. There was a mutual terror shared between them, an unspoken knowledge that they had to keep Tommy secret, that getting the police involved would only lead to, well, nothing good. I imagine upon arrival that Tommy threatened our family and then showed some sign of physical dominance over the men. I remembered the banging against the walls and the way my father had gripped his throat. But what the hell had he said to them? Why did they allow him to infest our homes? Well, a month later, I found out. They were plotting against Tommy. They were going to kill him. August 1969. Again, I was awoken from slumber. I looked at my Spider-Man clock and saw it was after midnight. I scrubbed sleep from my eyes, grasping in the dark for growls. As I found my bear, I heard banging from downstairs along with several voices. I slipped out of bed and went to my door. The lights downstairs were off, but I saw beams of light cutting through the black. Flashlights? I called out for my parents but saw that their bedroom door was wide open. I knew they weren't in bed then. More voices from downstairs followed, along with scraping across the hardwood floors. I jumped as a bang shook the night and then the voices faded. There's people going into the basement, I thought, frightened. Our basement was unfinished, an expanse of empty cement. Why are they going into the basement? I thought. Silently, assuming my parents were down there, I crept to the first floor, clutching growls to my chest. Sure enough, the basement door was open and I saw light reflecting off the dusty floor. I could hear my father's voice, and then the familiar voices of our neighbors. They were speaking to someone, and they were angry. My heart froze in my chest as someone laughed from the depths of the cellar. Making sure not to make a sound, I slunk to the open door and descended the first 2 steps to look out at the scene below me. Tommy was bound to a metal chair in the middle of the room, surrounded by the 6 pairs of parents that lived in our neighborhood. Their backs were to me, but I could see Tommy's flawless face gazing up at them. Megan's father was there, his face a mess of bruises and swollen flesh. His arm was in a sling and it looked like his shoulders slumped like his back was in pain. I sucked in a breath as I realized one of the men was passing my father a pistol. The women stood by their husbands with grim looks on their faces. There was no disagreement among the executioners. "It's time you leave our lives," one of the men said, looming over Tommy. I recognized him as my friend Luke's father. They lived 2 houses down. "This is your last chance," he growled. Tommy didn't even struggle in his rope bindings, that ever-present smile still on his face. He looked up at them, the overhead light illuminating his sparkling blue eyes. "I don't understand. I'm just trying to help all of you raise your children properly. I'm not going anywhere." A look passed between the parents, and then my father put the gun to Tommy's head. "You ain't helping anyone. You're a monster. You can't come into our homes and threaten our kids, threaten our lives. That ain't how this works. All those threats you whispered at us while we were caught off guard. Well, look at you now." My father spat on him. "Pathetic. And now you'll get yours." My father shot him in the head. The report was deafening and I almost screamed, slamming my hand over my mouth at the last second. Tommy's head whipped back and the smell of gun smoke filled the air. It was silent for a moment, and then... In horror, I watched as Tommy slowly raised his head to stare back up at my father. "What the hell?" one of the women breathed, her voice shaken. There was no blood, no shatter of bone, nothing. Just a dark circle on Tommy's forehead where the bullet had passed. "What the fuck are you?" someone whispered. Tommy's eyes spun to the man who had spoken. "I'm Tommy Taffy, and I'm not going anywhere." My mother suddenly pointed to the corner of the room, her hand trembling. "Gas, get the gas." Megan's mother went to the far corner of the room and picked up a small red can. I could hear the slosh of gasoline and I smelled it in the air. My father grabbed the can from her hand, her eyes wide, never leaving Tommy. Without a word, he upended it over the bound man, soaking him. Tommy kept smiling. Another father passed my dad a box of matches. My father struck one, his hand hovering in the air. "Go back to hell and leave us alone." Tommy's grin widened. "Hell is gonna seem like a fantasy when I come back for you." My father dropped the match and Tommy burst into flame. He didn't scream, he didn't thrash, he simply burned. As his face began to melt, his eyes shifted and suddenly he saw me. A heart exploding in my throat, I fled back to my room, tears streaming down my face. From the safety of my bed, I eventually heard the neighbors leaving, relief in their voices. 2 weeks later, Tommy came back. September 1969. We were eating supper, a sense of normalcy returning to our home. My parents never told me they had murdered Tommy, instead opting to inform me that his visit was over and he went back home. I still caught whiffs of gasoline about our home, but kept my mouth shut. I was just happy my family was okay. The sun was setting and the dying orange light filtered in through the living room window, stretching out across the floor to cover the dinner table. My mother and father sat at opposite ends, chatting about their days. I could tell they were still shaken, but I admired the way they were trying to return to their lives, to what it had been before Tommy showed up. As I shoveled mashed potatoes into my mouth, the front door exploded open. I spun around, jumping as the wood splintered and the hinges creaked. I dropped my fork, eyes growing wide. It was Tommy, and he looked furious. My parents' mouths dropped in unison, but before they could speak, Tommy marched towards us with alarming speed and upended the kitchen table. Dishes filled with food shattered to the floor, and my father half rose, fear paralyzing him. Without a word, Tommy grabbed my father by the neck and dragged him to the wall where he plowed his face through the sheetrock. My mother screamed and ran to aid my dad, but Tommy spun on her and punched her in the teeth, sending her crashing to the floor. Feeling my bladder go and panic clawing at my throat, I watched as Tommy pulled my father's bloody head from the wall. Sputtering, dazed, my father tried to release himself from Tommy's iron grip, but it did no good. His eyes dark and his mouth clamped in a snarl, and Tommy clamped a hand over my father's throat and dragged him into the living room. Without stopping, he threw him through the window and out into the front yard. I was a mess of tears and terror, snot bubbling from my nose as Tommy turned back to my mother and I. Now, he was smiling. He went to my stunned mother and hauled her up. "You're gonna need to see this," he said darkly, his lips curled in a grin. He looked at me and jerked his head towards the door. "Oh, come on, Spence. You too." He pulled my mother to the front door and pushed her outside. I hadn't moved, my face frozen in a silent scream. Tommy looked over his shoulder and winked at me. "Don't make me ask again, sport. And bring that broom behind you." Pulled off of my chair by fear, I got up and dutifully grabbed the kitchen broom and walked it to Tommy, my pants reeking of urine. Tommy put a hand on my shoulder and guided me outside to stand by our mailbox. I saw my father rolling in the grass, a mess of blood and glass, my mother kneeling before him, weeping. Our neighbors were coming out of their houses, eyes wide, shocked looks of horror on their faces as they saw Tommy. "Gather around," he yelled, motioning for them to come closer. "Look at what you've done." I saw Megan at her doorstep across the street, face a pale sheet of snow. She looked up at me and I saw her begin to cry, burying her face in her hands. Shocked into obedience, our neighbors came and stood around our tiny front lawn by the street, all eyes on my father and mother. "This is your fault," Tommy said, meeting every one of their terrified faces. He suddenly snatched the broom from my hands. In one quick motion, he snapped the head off, tossed the duster aside, and advanced on my father, gripping the splintered pole. My mother screamed and covered her bleeding husband with her body, but Tommy booted her in the face, wrenching my heart in the process. "Up you go," Tommy growled, pulling my father up by the hair onto his knees. Glass jutting from his face, my father looked up at Tommy, agony burning in his eyes. Don't worry. I'll take good care of your son," Tommy whispered. He raised the broken broom over his head like a spear and slammed it into my father's mouth, down his throat until it erupted from his stomach and plunged into the earth. Blood shot like a geyser out of my father and splattered Tommy's perfect features. My mother howled, her bloodshot eyes rattling in their sockets as my father gasped, and then died, his lips wrapping around the broom handle jutting from his mouth. The neighbors watching were paralyzed, a few of the women crying out at the sudden display of brutal violence. The men's faces were pale and shocked into silence. Megan's father leaning over and emptying his stomach onto the road, blood dripping from his face. Tommy turned to look at them, eyes alight. "I want you to think about this the next time you want to have a bonfire. Do I make myself clear?" All eyes were trained to the impaled figure of my father, pinned to the earth. "I said, do I make myself clear?" Tommy repeated, the smile dropping from his face. Everyone slowly nodded, every eye wet with tears and wide with horror. Tommy threw a thumb over his shoulder. "Now get rid of him. I need to put his son to bed." I took a step back, tears flowing freely from my eyes, shaken to the core, unable to stop staring at my dead father. My world swam and rocked, my vision a streaking blur of color. I felt like I was going to throw up, pass out, scream until I couldn't breathe anymore. Tommy was suddenly looming over me, sweeping me up in his arms. He pressed my shocked face into his shoulder and stroked my hair. As we went into the house and up to my bedroom, I heard a rumble in Tommy's chest. June 1973. How do I describe the following 3.5 years? Words can't make you understand what life was like for my mother and I. My father's murder was covered up by the neighborhood and my mother, despite the crippling pain it must have brought her. When the police eventually came to investigate, on request from his job, the story had already been carefully collaborated by the families. They told the police that my father had been cheating on my mother, and she had found out and kicked him out. Lies about arguments heard were told, along with a few scenarios where the neighbors saw my father sneaking out late at night. It was enough to get the police off of our street. They saw the pain in my mother's eyes, but misinterpreted the source. Everyone was petrified of Tommy Taffy. The lies told in order to assure safety of themselves and their families. An example had been given, a lesson learned. Listen to Tommy Taffy. Do what he wants, and pray that one day he'll go away and leave the broken community. My father wasn't the only one who had been punished. I noticed a couple of the neighbors sporting broken limbs or bruised faces. I can't even imagine the lies they told the outside world to cover up the truth. Tommy was a haunting nightmare in our lives, and we could find no way to get rid of him. The nightly lessons resumed. Just my mother and I now, sitting on the couch listening to our captor explain how to be a good person. I was 10 then, and it made me sick. Age slowly clarifying just how dismal our situation was. But I kept my mouth shut. I kept it shut for my mother. The memory of my father's execution burned bright in my skull every day. The years that followed my father's death marked a change in Tommy's habits. He now slept with my mother, every night leading her to bed after I was tucked in, and was told one last lesson about life. I would lay awake for hours, listening to her cry from her room. Sometimes it'd be for a few moments. Other times, hours. He didn't always stay with her through the night, though. I remember times I'd wake up and he'd be standing in the dark corner of my room, watching me sleep, his eyes like shining oceans. Other times he'd be staring at me through the crack in my door. He'd just stand there for hours, just fucking watching. Sometimes I'd wake up to him sliding into bed with me, always placing a cool hand over my thigh. Heart thundering, fear ripping apart my insides, I'd always turn away from him, breaking out in cold sweats. I still had growls, my constant source of childlike comfort. I'd hug him to my chest, and tears running down my face until either the sun came up or exhaustion shut my brain down. We endured this silently, begging for it to end. July 1974. I was 11. It was the 5th year to the day since Tommy had entered our lives. I sat in the living room, reading a book while my mother prepared supper for us. She was pale and gaunt, the long years wearing her down to the bone. Her eyes were lifeless these days and had sunk into her sockets, her cheekbones pronounced, skin thinly stretching over them. Growls lay on my chest as I reclined, trying to focus on my book. Tommy was sitting in the chair across from me, watching. I turned the page and jumped as Tommy spoke. "You really love that thing, don't you?" I turned to Tommy. My book?" Tommy shook his head, smiling. "No, son, that bear." I looked at growls on my chest and shrugged uncomfortably. I guess so." Tommy leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Put your book down, Spence. Licking my suddenly dry lips, I obeyed. I noticed my mother was watching from the kitchen, looking alarmed. Do you know what love means? Tommy asked. I fiddled with the growls, eyes downcast. It means you care for someone very much. Tommy shook his head. No. Good try, though. He suddenly came and sat next to me, placing a hand on my leg, caressing it. Love means you want to fuck something so bad, you'd die if you didn't. I heard my mother drop something in the kitchen, but I didn't dare take my eyes off of Tommy. And Tommy pointed to Growls. Do you want to fuck your teddy bear? I had heard some kids in school talking about fucking, but I didn't have a clear understanding of what it was yet. So I just shook my head, palms sweaty. Tommy looked confused. But you just said you loved Growls. So, you don't love him? My mother took a step towards us, her hands balled into fists, but kept her mouth sealed shut, her lips a thin white line. I guess I don't love him then, I stammered, feeling Tommy's hand tighten on my thigh. Tommy placed his other hand on the back of my head. Why don't you give him a little kiss and see what you think, yeah? I felt embarrassed and humiliated just at the thought, my cheeks burning. I tried to chuckle like I thought it was a joke, but Tommy slowly pushed my head towards my bear. Go ahead, son. Don't be afraid. I could feel tears brimming in my eyes as he guided my mouth towards my bear, and I gently kissed its nose, and turning away immediately. Do it again, Tommy whispered. Show him just how much you love him. Sniffling, tears now rolling down my face, I held up Growls and planted a few kisses on his worn nose. My face was flushed and my heart was racing. I felt foolish and absolutely terrified. Tommy's hand like a vice grip on the back of my neck, urging me on. Lick him a little, Tommy whispered in my ear. I suddenly jerked my head away and threw Growls across the room, openly sobbing now. I don't love him. I hate him. I hate him. I covered my face, ashamed, hands shaking. I pulled myself into a ball and lay there sobbing. I felt Tommy get up next to me and turn to my mother. It sounds like he's learned his last lesson. I'd be proud of him if I were you. He's a man now. I looked up at him through tear-soaked eyes. His eyes sparkled. It took 5 years. He suddenly leaned down and cupped his mouth over my ear. His voice was cold glass, his breath like hot fire. Your little ones will get 5 years as well, Spence. And with that, he looked at my mother one last time and walked out the door. My mother rushed me and took me in her arms, comforting me as I cried. Tommy never returned to our home. Time passed and I grew up. I grew up always expecting Tommy to show up again and come barging through our front door, but he never did. The years faded and some of the horror and pain began to fade as well. We were never the same, though. How could we be? My mother was a shell of the woman she used to be. The mental torture she had undergone had broken something inside of her she'd never regain. But God, did she love me and try to heal the nightmares of those 5 years. A full year passed before my mother dared ask Megan's mom if Tommy was gone from their home as well. He was. The neighborhood was free, impossibly, unbelievably free from the monster that had terrorized us for 5 awful years. I never understood what Tommy's final words were to me. what they meant. Not until it was too late. When I turned 25, I married Megan. A year later, we were expecting. You've heard the rest from my poor son. God forgive me for having children. I put my phone down, sighing heavily. I had just been speaking to my father, Spence. He told me he wasn't going to make it to Stephanie's for Sunday lunch tomorrow. He sounded tired and worn, but then again, he always sounded like that. I couldn't blame him. I felt the same exhaustion myself. We had carried it with us for years. The memories we held, the nightmares we had survived. He told me Mom wanted to go away, maybe to the mountains for a while. She wasn't doing well these days. It seemed like every week she was trying a new medication. The nights were the worst. My father had quietly admitted this to me. The tossing and turning, the fearful glances at the door, jumping at every sound. For my father and I, the passage of time wasn't enough to erase the fear that was seared into our minds like a brand. Stephanie seemed to be doing the best out of the four of us. She was happily married, and her baby twins were almost 3 months old now. She had named them Jack and Jill. She thought it was cute, and I thought so too. Her husband Louis was a good guy. He took care of them. A selfless, strong man who put his children and wife before all. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, glancing at the clock. It was almost 11. I thought about retiring for the night, but instead got up and poured myself a shot of rum. I downed it without even thinking and let the heat settle my worn mind. I went to go to the bathroom and heard my phone ringing from where I had left it on the couch. I went to pick it up, expecting it to be my father again. It was Stephanie. Why is she calling me this late? I thought to myself, immediately going full alert. I placed the cell to my ear. Hello? Steph? It was silent for a few moments, something rubbing against the speaker. Then my sister's voice trickled through the line, terrified and thin.
Matt?
My brow furrowed. Yeah, I'm here. Is everything okay? More heavy breathing. Then a thick whisper.
Matt, he's here.
The line went dead. My heart began to race, fear suddenly roaring in the silence. I stood in the dark, a phone pressed to my head, eyes growing wide. Oh no. Jesus Christ, please, no, not yet. I immediately redialed Stephanie, but it went to voicemail. As I placed the phone down on the counter, I realized my hands were shaking. I poured myself another shot of rum and threw it back. I began to pace, trembling in the dark, mind spinning. It was everything I had ever feared, but it was too soon. Way too soon. Oh, fuck. I collapsed on the couch and tried to call Stephanie again. It rang once, twice, and then it picked up. Steph, tell me exactly what's going on. Are you okay? There was no response, but I could hear something in the background, muffled and urgent. Tears were forming in my eyes. Jesus, Steph, please, tell me you're okay. Then a voice like cold silk. Hello, Matt. Oh, it has been some time, hasn't it? Recognition blasted through me like an icy wind, swirling through the depths of my mind and ripping apart every horror I had ever witnessed. Bile lurched in my stomach and sweat broke out across my forehead. Voice trembling, I asked in a whisper, Tommy? The line went dead again. I stood up, clawing at my hair, vomit threatening my throat. No, this This wasn't happening. Please, damn it, damn it, damn it, damn it. I couldn't stop shaking, the voice on the phone opening up years of suppressed nightmares, tearing the chains and shattering the locks. I collapsed on my knees and vomited onto the floor, unable to hold it back any longer. I stared at nothing, bloodshot eyes blinking rapidly. 5 more years. I couldn't do it. I screamed, pounding the floor with a fist. I got to my feet and snatched my keys from the countertop. Stephanie only lived a couple of minutes away. I wasn't going to let this happen. Not again. I slammed the car into park, panting. Stephanie's home was lit up like a distress beacon, but the drapes were drawn across the front windows. I couldn't see any signs of movement, no shadows, nothing. I wrung my hands, racking my brain. What exactly was I gonna do? What was my plan here? I just knew I had to do something. I wasn't gonna let my sister's family suffer like ours had. And what about Louis? He would have no idea what was going on. He would fight back. Oh no. Taking a deep breath, I opened my car door, the cool night air hitting my face like a splash of water. My sister's street was dark, the quaint line of single-story houses lining the road like blacked-out bricks, except for Stephanie's. Rubbing my hands on my pant legs, I approached the front door, heart hammering in my chest like a wild drum. My throat was dry and a voice in my head screamed to just go back home, but I couldn't. Not until I knew Stephanie and her family were okay. Maybe I could... Oh, fuck. Maybe I could what? I was standing before the front door. I ran a hand across my forehead and then knocked. It sounded like gunshots in the night. I pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't hear anything through the thick wood. As I raised my fist to knock again, the lights in the house went out. I pounded on the door now, terror and urgency detonating in my chest like a bomb. Stephanie, it's me, Matt. Come on, open up the door if you can. And suddenly I heard the deadbolt turn. I stepped back as the door cracked open, breath rushing from my lungs like a discarded balloon. 2 blue eyes shined from the darkness, glowing like crystals of fire. And then a voice, smooth as cream. Ah, a little late for a visit, don't you think, Matt? Staring into those burning blue eyes, hearing my name from his foul lips, it took everything I had to keep standing. Where's Stephanie and the babies? Where's Louis? I finally choked out, frozen on the front steps, unable to look away from his eyes gazing at me from the black. We're all here. Just get in. Reacquainted? Ah, Louis wasn't very welcoming. What have you done? And suddenly the lights in the house went on and the eyes in the door melted into a face and head and body. A shockwave of horrific memory rocketed through me, almost sending me to my knees. Tommy Taffy looked exactly how I had remembered him from all those years ago. His short blonde hair, the small nub jutting from his face where his nose should have been, the eerie strip of seamless white where his teeth should have been, and his ever-glowing blue eyes, so intense they threatened to drown me. His perfect, impossibly flawless skin gleamed in the light, reminding me of soft plastic. Tommy pulled the door open, gesturing inside with his hand. Ah, you came to see your sister, didn't ya? From my place on the steps, I could see directly into the kitchen. Louis was slumped on the floor, motionless by the table, and Stephanie was next to him, weeping, clutching at his still body. She looked towards the door and saw me, her eyes widening, desperation shaking her voice. Matt, Matt, help us, please." The agony stretched across her face tore me apart. Tears blooming in my own eyes, I went to push past Tommy, but he grabbed my shoulder, stopping me. You saw your sister? No need to get involved," Tommy said, his grip like an iron clamp, digging into my collarbone. I turned to Tommy, one foot in the house. "Please, leave them alone. Haven't you taken enough from our family?" It's time for you to go, Matt," Tommy said, pushing me back outside. Stephanie wailed, screaming my name from her place beside Lewis. I tried to step around Tommy, desperation raking my voice. Please, just let..." I was cut off as Tommy suddenly stepped forward and grabbed me by the throat. He slammed me against the side of the house, never releasing his grip. His face was inches from mine, his voice like burning coals, but his face remained calm. "I told you to go. Don't make it worse for them. This isn't about you anymore." I gasped as he released me, slumping to my knees in the dewy grass. I watched helpless as Tommy went back inside and slammed the front door. The lights in the house went out, and then the screaming began. I sat in my dark apartment, the bottle of rum beside me almost as empty as my gaze. The sun was rising, a soft pink glow tickling the horizon through the window. I hadn't slept, my imagination running rampant. I couldn't let Stephanie live through this, not again, not for another 5 years. Time had hidden the abominations of our childhood from my sister, Tommy entering our lives at an age she could still forget. The twins. He had come back because of the twins, Jack and Jill, to continue his reign of terror through the generations of our family. When would it end? How could it end? The hours offered no solution, the rum burning in my gut giving no comfort. And then my cell phone rang, startling me. I blinked and realized the sun was now burning cheerily through the window. How long had I been sitting here? My heart jumped as I saw it was Stephanie calling me. I hurriedly answered. Hello, Steph, are you okay? What has he done?" My sister's voice was emotionless and flat.
"Tommy said it was okay for you to come over for lunch, just like we planned."
"What did he do to you?" Her voice never changed.
"He's feeding the twins. Everything is okay."
"Steph," I started, but she hung up. I rose and rushed to the bathroom, splashing water over my face. The rum seemed to have no effect on me, my eyes meeting my face in the mirror with surprising clarity. But that did nothing to dilute the fear that plagued my mind. I raced out of my apartment and into my car. As I drove, I found myself becoming sick. Claws dug into my memory and uprooted the past horrors I'd experienced at the hands of Tommy. I couldn't let Jack and Jill go through that. I couldn't let Stephanie watch her family slowly get torn apart. A couple minutes later, and I was parking in front of her home. I anxiously got out of the car and went to the front door where I knocked, and Tommy answered, a baby in each arm. Hello, Matt. Good to see you at a more appropriate hour. Come on in." Just seeing him touch the children made my skin crawl and my stomach clench, but I shut my mouth and said nothing. I walked past him and he kicked the door shut behind me, bouncing the babies in his arms and beaming down at them. "Oh, beautiful children, aren't they?" Tommy said softly, staring down into their faces. "Where's my sister?" I asked, a trickle of sweat running down my spine like a ghost. As if to answer, Stephanie came walking down the stairs. Her skin was pale and dark bags hung from her eyes. There was no sign of physical violence, but I knew that Tommy had other ways to punish people. "Lunch is ready," she said tonelessly, her eyes dead. She walked into the kitchen and began setting food on the table. I followed her, and then froze. Louis was slumped over the table, breathing heavily. One side of his face was swollen, closing his left eye. Blood leaked from his mouth onto the empty dinner plate before him. His legs had been broken, his shins and ankles twisting along the sides of the chair at angles that turned my stomach. Upon seeing me, he raised his head, trailing drool and blood from the corners of his mouth. "Get this monster out of my house," he whispered to me. Before I had any chance to respond, Tommy was sweeping in behind me, cooing down at the babies. Stephanie was like a zombie, placing the steaming platters of food before us and then sitting in the chair opposite her bleeding husband. "Jesus, Louis, we need to get you some help. Come on, I'm taking you to the hospital." Tommy looked up at me from the babies. "Sit down and enjoy the food your sister so lovingly made for you. It would be terribly wasteful to ignore such a feast." As if to lead by example, Tommy took a place at the table, the gurgling, oblivious twins chirping in his arms. "He needs help, Tommy," I insisted, terrified of the words coming out of my mouth. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Matt." I suddenly slammed my hand down on the table. "I'm taking him to the hospital, damn it." Immediately, I regretted my sudden aggression. The gasoline fire in my chest was doused instantly as Tommy's shining blue eyes met mine. Wordlessly, Tommy stood and handed Jill to Stephanie, who gratefully accepted her daughter. Eyes never leaving me, Tommy took Jack and went to the sink. He turned on the garbage disposal. Horror ripped through my brain like a blazing locomotive. The loud whirring of the blades filled the kitchen and choked the fight from me, replacing it with furious caution. Get away from there," Louis screamed, struggling to stand, but screaming as his broken bones squirmed against his twisted flesh. Tommy lowered the now crying Jack towards the black mouth of the garbage disposal, his eyes never leaving me. "It would be a tight squeeze, but I think I could get him to fit," Tommy said, his voice like the edge of a knife. I raised a trembling hand. "Stop. Okay, please, just stop." But Tommy kept lowering the baby, its howling face now inches from the opening. "I only need one, Matt. Maybe you need a lesson. Maybe you forgot." Her eyes bulging from her face, tears silently streaming down her cheeks, and tears of terror pouring from my eyes. "Just don't hurt the baby. Don't hurt Jack." Tommy's eyes bore into my skull, examining my words like they were under a microscope. Finally, he turned and switched off the garbage disposal, handing Jack to Stephanie. I let out a shuddered sigh of relief and shakily got to my feet. Tommy took a seat at the table and pointed for me to do the same. I didn't hesitate. "You godless fuck," Louis growled, clenching his fist. "I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna fucking kill you." Tommy turned to him and I saw his jaw clench. "Don't push me, Louis. It won't end well." "Fuck you," Louis spat. Like lightning, Tommy stood and stepped towards Louis, sliding his hand into the beaten man's mouth to grip his upper jaw. Without slowing, Tommy heaved Louis out of his chair and threw him face first into the refrigerator. With a dull thud, Louis's face erupted in a fountain of blood and shattered teeth as he collided in his wake. Face like smooth stone, Tommy lifted him by the hair and dragged him to the oven. He pulled the door down and shoved Louis's head into the crack. Without hesitating, Tommy began to smash his skull between the oven and its door, each blow crunching into his head and splitting the skin. "Stop it, Tommy, stop it, you're gonna kill him," I screamed, leaping across the table. "It's him or the baby? Who's it gonna be?" I collapsed in my chair, eyes wide, entire body shaking. Tears poured from my eyes, my lips twisting and quivering to form words, but only helpless sobs escaped. The twins were howling, and Stephanie clutched them to her chest, weeping, shock washing over her in horrified waves. I turned away, world rocking, ears filling with screaming and crying as Tommy crushed Louis's head with the oven door. The spittle flew from my lips with each ragged breath I sucked into my lungs, reality bending and darkening. Tommy straightened, panting, observing his work. Blood splatter painted the cabinets and floor, slow trails that oozed like reaching fingers. Stephanie was weeping, eyes squeezed shut, and twins mimicking their mother's sorrow. Tommy ran a hand through his hair, exhaling, his eyes meeting mine. He smiled, shaking his head like he couldn't believe it. He then turned to Stephanie and motioned for the babies. "Give them to me. Clean up your husband's mess." My nails were digging into the tabletop, knuckles white. I couldn't believe the carnage I had just witnessed, the brutal execution of my brother-in-law. I was shaken to the core, my vision spinning in disbelief. Tommy leaned down and snatched the babies from my sister. "Oh, put them in the basement for now." Why did you have to do that?" Stephanie squeaked between sobs. Tommy began to soothe the twins, shooting a look at my sister. "Oh, he wasn't right for this family. Now, clean him up." And my mentally shattered sister began to drag her husband towards the basement door. Drool leaked from her lips as she whispered loving apologies to the deceased. She was breaking. In a horrific daze, I followed Tommy into the living room, feeling like I was in a dream. I wanted to murder this monster, rip this cancer from my family, but another part of me knew I couldn't, that attempting to do so would just bring more violence. There just had to be a way, though. Tommy had settled the twins and was now watching me. "Are you okay, Matt?" I said nothing, my shell-shocked eyes staring into nothing. Tommy nodded. Yeah, I know this is probably upsetting. That's why I wanted to talk to you in private. I'm worried about your sister and how she's going to take all of this. I'm worried about how it'll affect her parenting." My eyes rose to meet his, my voice incredulous. You did the only chance we have of settling her mind after such a tragedy." My hands were clenched by my sides. "One day, someone is going to stop you." And Tommy smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Careful, Matt. Just leave my sister alone. Get out of her life," I said through gritted teeth. I can't do that. Not with such beautiful children to be raised. Oh, in fact, that's the reason I'm here so early. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see them." His eyes glowed, twin spotlights cutting into the darkness of my mind. I took a step towards him, whispering, "What the fuck are you?" I stayed with Stephanie that night. It had taken her almost 3 hours to clean up Louis, and when she was finished, she went to her bedroom and collapsed. I put the babies to bed after giving them a bottle and stood on the balcony, staring down into the empty living room. Everything felt wrong, like I was dreaming. The shocking events that were slowly twisting my life dug into my brain, unearthing every horror I'd spent years burying. A hand rested on my shoulder. I turned to see Tommy, the light in my sister's bedroom glowing behind him. Go, be with her tonight. It's important she feels the warmth of a man beside her. It'll help ease her husband's passing. I said nothing, just stared into Tommy's smooth face. Every ounce of me screamed to plunge my fingers into his eyes. Tommy pushed me toward Stephanie's bedroom. Go. Wordlessly, I walked down the hall and into my sister's bedroom. I shut the door behind me and went to sit on the bed. Stephanie was under the covers, staring at the ceiling through bloodshot eyes. Her skin was pale and heavy bags dripped down her cheeks. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I laid down next to her and turned off the lamp. After a couple of hours, I blessedly heard the shallow breath of sleep beside me. Good, I thought. Let her mind have a few hours of peace. The deep hours of the night snuck up on me, but I barely even noticed. My mind refused to shut down. Ideas and possible ways out circling my exhausted mind like water circling a drain. Something Tommy had said kept echoing in my mind. I only need one of them. I examined those words, ringing out every possible meaning and scenario they could represent. I didn't like what I found. I glanced at my sleeping sister next to me, her suffering apparent even in slumber. My heart screamed for her, and I felt my eyes well up. She didn't deserve this. Not again. Not for another 5 years. I couldn't watch that. I couldn't let it happen. What was I willing to do to save her? What kind of person would I have become? How could I possibly live with myself if I did what the darkness whispered? You know how to save her. Something chuckled from the black. Tommy made a mistake tonight. Or was it? Maybe he's testing you. Either way, you know you can't continue like this. You can't live knowing your dear sister is breaking. I covered my face in the dark, tears staining my face. What kind of person would I be? At some point in the night, I became aware of something by my bedroom door. I turned my head and saw Tommy watching us through a crack in the door, his blue eyes illuminating the darkness to cast a soft glow across his smiling face. I shivered and turned away. It was hours before I felt his gaze leave me. I awoke to a scream. I bolted upright, sleep leaving me in an instant. I didn't remember falling asleep, but the dark gloom from the window told me it was late. I glanced at the clock on the bedside and saw it was almost 10. Rain threw itself against the house, a wind slamming angrily against the windows. Another scream shot me out of bed. It was Stephanie. I looked at the empty bed and my heart began to race. I sprinted out of the room and into the hallway. Tommy was marching up the stairs, holding my sister by the hair. She was grasping at his wrists, tears running down her face in agony as he shook her, screaming down into her face. When will you learn? He howled, never slowing his step. My heart crawled up my throat and sickness boiled in my stomach. What happened? Tommy, let go of her. Still dragging my sister, Tommy ascended to the top of the stairs. He reached out and palmed my face, throwing me hard against the far wall. Stars exploded in my vision as my head bounced off the sheetrock, sending me to my knees. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wasn't calling anyone. I promise. Stephanie howled as Tommy pulled her towards her bedroom. The police can't help you. Matt can't help you. Only I can help you. Tommy snarled. He threw her across the room onto the bed and turned back to me. Fury stretched his face and burned in his eyes. "Your sister needs another lesson," he growled before slamming the door and locking it. I crawled to my feet, racing to the door. I jiggled the handle and pounded on the wood, screaming, begging. From inside, I heard something crash, and then my sister's voice arched and rose, reaching an almost animalistic height of hysteria. "Tommy, stop! Tommy, please, just leave her alone," I cried, slamming myself against the door. It didn't budge, and my sister continued to howl. I spun in the hallway, clawing at my hair, eyes wide. Son of a bitch. My heart motored in my chest and my whole body shook. A sense of maddening helplessness and anguish threatened to overwhelm me. "Stop this," my mind screamed. "You have to stop this." I pounded the wall, tears rolling down my face. No, 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 no. She still has a chance. She can recover from this plague. Do something before it's too late, my mind howled. Breath hitching in my throat, my sister's scream echoing and crashing into my skull. I turned to the twins' room. I squeezed my fists together, world blurring through tear-soaked eyes, and went in. Jack and Jill were sniffling in their cribs, staring up at me with confused expressions. I looked down at them, sobbing, placing my forehead against Jill's crib. No, 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 no. Please, please. I righted myself and reached down, stroking her soft cheek. Snot bubbled from my nose, a face a wet mess of agony and mental devastation. "I'm so sorry, little one," I whispered, Stephanie's shrieks collapsing my willpower. "But you can't understand the pain your mother is going through, what she'll have to endure. I love you and Jack with all of my heart, but I love my sister more." I picked up a pillow and placed it over the child's face. It took 48 seconds for Jill to die. Hoarse cries rattled my chest. Prayers of forgiveness poured from my lips. I went to Jack's crib and killed him. When it was over, I threw the pillow against the wall and slumped down to my knees, raining the floor with tears of horror at what I had just done. My mind cracked, ripping in two and bleeding sorrow and self-hatred through my body. Suddenly, something was roughing and hauling me to my feet. I coughed as a hand gripped my throat and slammed me against the wall. I blinked and stared through grief-stricken eyes into Tommy's enraged face. "What have you done?" he bellowed, shaking. Through the misery, a deep, murderous hatred blazed in my chest like wildfire. I leaned into Tommy, voice like hot steel. "I'm freeing this family from your shadow." Screaming, I smashed my face into his as hard as I could. My vision blinked, the darkness quickly clearing under a storming rage. Tommy howled, stumbling backwards, clutching his own face. Something yellow and thick dripped from his mouth. He looked down at it, eyes growing wide. "I knew you could bleed," I snarled, wiping the tears from my face. And Tommy stared at his covered hand and then back up at me, fury reigniting. "What have you done to the children?" "I killed your lifeline," I hissed. Before he could respond, I charged him. I threw my body into his, slamming him against the far wall with a heavy thud. The surprise and pain that rippled across his face fueled my sudden murderous hunger. I grabbed his hair and ripped his face to the side, burying my teeth into his soft throat. He screamed as my jaw snapped shut, my mouth filling with warmth and shredded flesh. I spat the mouthful out as Tommy shoved me back, a hand going to his gushing throat. his fingers coated with the yellow liquid pouring down his shirt and chest. I didn't let him recover. I grabbed a lamp and brought it into his crashing skull, bringing him to his knees. I drove a fist under his chin while simultaneously swinging the lamp again, driving the butt directly into his eyes. He howled, falling against the wall, reaching out, desperate. I knelt over him, tossing the lamp aside. My fists thudded into the gaping hole into his throat, summoning new howls of agony. It fueled me, ignited me, filled me with rage. I stood and kicked him onto his stomach. He started to crawl towards the door, but I brought a foot down into his spine, causing him to twist and shriek. And keeping my foot on his back, panting, I leaned down, voice like venom. "It's over, Tommy, you motherfucker." Even through the obvious pain, he twisted, his eyes burning with hatred, his voice hoarse. You can't kill me. There are other families." I reached down and gripped beneath his chin with both hands. "But not my family." I pulled back as hard as I could, muscles straining and screaming, howling, thrashing. Tommy's neck bent backwards until the skin in his throat split with a sickening pop. I didn't stop, sweat pouring from my brow, fingers digging into his skin. With a deafening crack, Tommy's spine broke at the base of his neck. And then he was still. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping, muscles burning. I stared at the motionless body, fresh tears in my eyes. I had done it. I had killed Tommy Taffy. A wave of relief and sorrow rolled through me like a rising tide. A hot and cold crashing into each other as the consequences of my actions stabbed me with needle-thin blades. What have you done? I rushed Stephanie to the hospital, calling the police on the way. I told them an intruder had broken into the home and murdered Lewis and the kids. I didn't wait for the questions, my main concern getting my unconscious sister medical attention. That day, something in me broke. Something I can never heal or replace. A dark shadow hovers over my soul. A deadly reminder of what I did to save my sister. Guilt and anguish. Those are just words compared to how I feel. I don't know if I'll be able to live with myself much longer, but I know Stephanie will live, my dear sister. The news of her children's demise rocked her to the bone. I stayed with her through it all. Those long nights in the hospital filled with overwhelming sadness and grief. I told her Tommy had killed them, and it's a lie I will take to the grave, whenever that may come. And when the sorrow threatens to kill me, I know deep down that Tommy is forever gone from our lives. Because of me, because of what I did, our family will die free from the shadow of that monster. That monster, Tommy Taffy.
Hey everybody, Nightmares Nightly here. I just wanted to take a minute to thank all of you for all of the support and kind words on the channel so far. If you'd like to help the channel even more, share this video or others with people who you think might enjoy them. I'd also like to thank Elias Witherow for his amazing collection of stories and his incredible writing talent. I'll be leaving links down in the description where you can find more of his work on Amazon. He has a number of books on there, along with another tale from Tommy Taffy. I've bought and read everything he's written, and it's all worth it, especially The Black Farm, which comes out of his original short story, Feed the Pig, one of my favorite creepypastas of all time. And as always, thanks for listening, everybody.